I know that you're all pretty much aware at this point that God hides himself and his attributes in nature, in his earthly creatures, in the elements, in the glory of the heavens that we call outer space, and that we learn about him and who he is just by observing the behavior of these things. Now, in the past, if you'll recall, we learned about fog and confusion, as in the fog of war. We looked at the heat of the kiln and its effects on clay. Most recently, we found that we tend to chew on our thoughts over and over again, just like cows that chew their cud and they're ruminating. And so, just like Jesus, when he was driven to the wilderness to be tempted, his response to Satan always was, "It is written." So it's my hope that in addition to the written word, that you will recall to mind things we have learned from God's creation, to understand God and his ways, so that you can say to your adversary when he approaches you, in your tough time, you can say, in all of creation, it is written. I can look anywhere, and I can see it is written. And this actually is the basis of what Paul says in Romans, that no man, he said, no man from the beginning of time has any excuse. It doesn't matter whether the written word ever reached them. He says they have no excuse because God made sure that he revealed himself in his creation. All it takes are seeing eyes and hearing ears. So today I would like to take a look at various forces that have an effect on us and their role in God's interaction with us. Forces that shape us, that guide us, forces that even restrict us. So we're going to look at, number one, forces that hinder. Number two, forces that pull and push. Number three, we're going to look at forces that guide. Number four, there are forces that push down and that lift up. So, first of all, the force of hindrance. In the hallway of my house, I have a digital thermometer, and it gives me a reading of the temperature on our main level, and it also gives a reading of the temperature in our apartment below, where I have a sensor down there to transmit it. Now, this thermometer also has what's called a barometer that displays the air pressure outside. It has a little icon as the pressure changes. It has a little icon that either shows rain clouds, or it shows just cloudiness, or it shows sunshine. Whichever way the weather's trending. Now, generally, the air pressure reading is somewhere between low 29 and high 31. So, I usually don't pay much attention to the barometer. It's just kind of a nice thing to have. I remember my dad had a barometer, had it hanging on the wall, and it was a dial kind of barometer. I remember him going over there every few days, and he'd go tap, 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 because sometimes the needle would not be responding to the pressure, but if you tapped it, it was like, it broke loose from its mechanism, and it could move freely and respond to the air pressure. And I remember go boom, and it'd flip over just a little bit. So those are the old thermometers, but I think the digital barometer that I have takes a reading from probably the internet because my thermometer is connected. But it's the barometer in that whole little barometer system. It's the barometer that actually shows the effects of the forces of weather. Now, a little more than 10 days ago, a weather disturbance in the Atlantic Ocean was forming to such an extent that it developed into a tropical storm. And soon it earned a very famous name now, Dorian. It was the fourth named storm of the storm season, and the storm season goes from May until November. As it moved along, the storm, it was traveling, as most storms do in the Atlantic Ocean, in a westerly direction at normal speeds, eventually morphing into a true hurricane. And it was heading toward the Caribbean and the United States. But curiously, when it reached the Bahamas, Dorian significantly slowed down to an unheard of slow speed of only 1 mile an hour, which had the effect of actually just stopping the hurricane over the Bahamas. So basically, when it reached those tropical islands, it just parked itself, just like parking a car in a parking lot at a store. You're moving along down the street and boom, there's your parking spot and you just stop. But it stopped with terribly catastrophic results. And never has a monster storm slowed so much to a crawling pace for such a long time. Now, how did this happen? Most hurricanes that I have seen always, if they come below Florida and go up through the Gulf and either go into Mexico or Texas or Louisiana or Mississippi, there's always this constant moving along its path. But this one was as though it hit a brick wall. So what happened? Well, the barometer would tell us what happened. The answer lies in the forces of weather. In this case, it was a hindering force. I was watching the Weather Channel, and there on the screen, because I didn't have this idea in my mind, but suddenly there on the screen was a picture of the weather systems of the whole eastern United States. And whereas Dorian was coming from Africa across the islands, as soon as it reached Bahama, it stopped. But on the map, it showed here over the southeastern part of the United States was a high pressure system. If you just go east a little bit out into the Atlantic Ocean, was another massive high pressure system, butted up against each other. In other words, there was no space between the two high pressure systems. That's why Dorian stopped. Because as strong as a hurricane is, it is still considered a low pressure system. This unfortunate weather event was the result of the two strong high pressure systems. And because hurricanes are by nature low pressure, they are guided by the other pressures around them. Only after several days did the high pressure systems move apart so that Dorian could move on. And it's now somewhere far out into the North Atlantic off the tip coast of Canada. So there's an example of weather, nature pressures working to devastation. Our hot, sunshiny weather system, high pressure weather system, was devastation for Bahamas. We had sunshine and it was hot, and we probably didn't like the continued heat. But that produced a terrible situation somewhere else. Now there's also man's hindrance. A couple millenniums ago, people of Jerusalem were taken away from their city by King Nebuchadnezzar to Babylon. And because God was out of patience with their hard, disobedient hearts, he says, I'm going to allow a foreign king to come and take you away. I'm finished. I won't hear you anymore. It's time that you understand what I mean. So, they were taken away, and when their 70 years of captivity were over, they returned to Jerusalem from Babylon. God said, I'll only have you taken away for 70 years. So, two men, Ezra and Nehemiah, began the work of rebuilding the walls of the city that had been torn down. They'd received not only permission to do so, but they were given financial and material help by a foreign king. Now, there were people who had lived in the Jerusalem area the entire time that the Israelites were taken away. And so once the returning people, once they started work on the walls, well, these longtime residents resented the attempt to rebuild the walls. So, a couple of guys, actually three, named, well, these two are Sanballat and Tobiah. They took it upon themselves to see that the building of the walls could never get accomplished. And so as we read in the account from Nehemiah himself, in Nehemiah 2, verses 18 and 19, he says, I also told them, the returning Israelites, about the gracious hand of my God upon me, and what the king had said to me. And they, the Israelites, replied, let us start rebuilding. And they set their hands to this good work. When Sanballat the Horonite, Tobiah the Amorite official, and Geshem the Arab heard about this, they mocked us and ridiculed us. So, human opposition, human hindrance. This was all with the intent to discourage the people from building the walls of the city. So here is an example of not nature, as in the weather, but people taking it upon themselves to intervene and attempt to hinder progress. A good example of the force of hindrance from man. Number two, there are forces that pull and push. Push and pull. How do scientists know what the path of an object in space will be? Let me read. Scientists know the basic laws of physics or movement rules that objects in space follow. Because of this, if a scientist knows how big something is, how fast it's going, the direction it's going, and what it will be going near, that scientist can figure out what the flight path of that object will be. A very basic principle of physics says that if something is going in a straight line, it will keep going in a straight line at the same speed unless a force makes it change or stop. The bigger something is, the harder it is to stop or to change its course. That's why if you were to, say, drop a bowling ball 15 pounds on a glass table, it'll probably shatter the glass and break through. But if you take a little marble, much lighter, and drop it on that glass, it'll be stopped by the glass because the marble is not large enough. The force of the glass stopped the progression of the marble, but it did not stop the progression of the larger and heavier bowling ball. Gravity is the most important force affecting movement in space. The strength of gravity's pull between two objects depends on how big they are and how close they are. One object is a lot bigger than the other, and so most of the gravitational pull results in the smaller body being pulled toward the larger one. If a scientist knows how big something is, how fast it's moving, how close it is to the other things with gravity, he can use a calculator and a math book to determine the path of that object. End of reading. So our own planets, then, which circle the sun, are controlled by their own forces of gravity and the gravity of the sun and stars, keeping everything in non-destructive, predictable orbits. So isn't it a wonder when you see that for millenniums these planets have been circling, and the only thing that controls their orbits is their gravitational pull on each other? Which says that when Earth moves around over here, that the gravitational pull of the sun plus Pluto is turning it this way. And then as it moves this way, the pull of Jupiter over here pulls the Earth this way. So as the planets are placed as God wanted them in their perfect places, everything keeps in their orbits because their gravities push and pull. Pull here, transfer to over here, and all around until they all are going in a perfect circle that never varies. An interesting, sometimes puzzling event in space is seeing an object moving such that scientists cannot account for the path of the object. Remember, we said that if there's a larger object, it will pull a smaller object. But there are objects moving in space that they're seeing on a certain path, but they don't see what it is. They don't see anything there to pull that object. It's as though, what's going on here? We know that there are forces working in space. So if an object is being diverted, but we can't see what it is, then it must be something far, far away and huge. Can be calculated. But now that it's been determined that there are such things as black holes and dark matter in the universe, scientists are believing that it's these sorts of new things that determine the path of space objects. Even galaxies have influence upon each other because of their size and positioning. So, how marvelous a thing it is that all these gigantic space objects, planets, moons, stars, galaxies, that are light years distance apart, are all influencing one another and keeping themselves in orderly orbits so that they do not crash into each other. All this is a testimony of God's power and perfection. This is what Paul had in mind. You want to see the wonder of God? Why do the planets maintain their orbits? Why is there orderliness in the heavens? Of course, all this pushing and pulling reminds me of people who say, I feel like I'm being pulled in 1,000 different directions. Yeah, well, maybe so. But maybe that's what's keeping you in the orbit God has for you. So, force number 3, a force that guides. I'm going to read an account that you're probably familiar with, but maybe you haven't read it in a while. It's from Acts 27. Paul had been taken as a prisoner. He was in chains. He was being transported to Rome. God had appointed it. Acts 27. I'm just going to skip through verses here so that we don't read the entire account. When it was decided that we would sail for Italy, Paul and some other prisoners were handed over to a centurion named Julius. We boarded a ship about to sail for ports along the coast of Asia. When a gentle south wind began to blow, we took up the anchor and sailed along, hugging the coast of Crete. But it was not long before a cyclone, or a water tornado, swept down across the island. Unable to head into the wind, the ship was moved in a different direction. So we gave way and let ourselves be driven along. We were tossed so violently that the next day the men began to throw out the cargo. On the third day they threw the ship's gear overboard with their own hands. And when neither sun nor stars appeared for many days, and the great storm continued to batter us, we abandoned all hope of being saved. On the 14th night, we were still being driven across the sea. About midnight, the sailors sensed they were approaching land. They took soundings and found that the water was 120 feet deep. Going a little further, they took another set of soundings that read 90 feet. Fearing that we would run aground on the rocks, they dropped 4 anchors and prayed for daybreak. When daylight came, they did not recognize the land, but they sighted a bay with a sandy beach, where they decided to run the ship aground if they could. Cutting away the anchors, they left them in the sea as they loosened the ropes that held the rudders. Then they hoisted the sail to the wind and headed for the beach. But the vessel struck a sandbar and ran aground. The front of the boat stuck fast and would not move, and the rear of the boat was being broken up by the pounding of the waves. Once we were safely ashore, we learned that the island was called Malta. The islanders showed us extraordinary kindness. They kindled a fire and welcomed all of us because it was raining and cold. Paul gathered a bunch of sticks, and as he laid them on the fire, a snake, driven out by the heat, fastened itself to his hand. And when the islanders saw the creature hanging from his hand, they said to one another, "Surely this man is a murderer. Although he was saved from the sea, justice has not allowed him to live." But Paul shook the creature off into the fire and suffered no ill effects. The islanders were expecting him to swell up or suddenly to drop dead, but after waiting a long time and seeing nothing unusual happen, they changed their minds and said he was a god. Now nearby was an estate belonging to Publius, the chief official of the island. He welcomed us and entertained us hospitably for 3 days. The father of Publius was sick in bed, suffering from fever and dysentery. Paul went in to see him, and after praying and placing his hands on him, the man was healed. After this had happened, the rest of the sick on the island came and were cured as well. The islanders honored us in many ways and supplied our needs when we were ready to sail. What an adventure! Totally unplanned, totally unexpected. So as you can see, by the intervening and not so pleasant guidance of the weather, Paul and the ship were led to the island of Malta, where a significant witness of God's power was displayed for a testimony. And in return, the travelers were given the provision of supplies for their continued travels. Number 4, there are forces that push down and forces that lift up. Forces of oppression and depression. Psalm 42:11. Why are you downcast, O my soul? Why is there unease within me? Now here's an admission of a soul greatly troubled. And you know, often this cannot be avoided. Circumstances become overwhelming. So I certainly do not have any condemnation for those who find themselves in this place. I've been there. And I even can be if my defenses are not in place. It's proof of our humanity, of our weaknesses, our vulnerability to evil spiritual forces. But we're not to remain there. So to counter that, there's a force that lifts up. Isaiah 40:31. But those who wait upon the Lord will renew their strength. They will mount up with wings like eagles. They will run and not grow weary. They will walk and not faint. So we are to rise as on wings of eagles. But pay attention to the key words of this verse. Let me read it again. What are the key words? But those who wait upon the Lord will renew their strength. They will mount up with wings like eagles. They will run and not be weary. They will walk and not faint. It's not renew their strength. It's not mount up. It's not run and not grow weary, and it's not walk and not faint. The key words are they will. Those who wait upon the Lord, they will renew their strength. They will mount up with wings like eagles. They will run and not grow weary. They will walk and not faint. So yes, let me hang on to that and believe it. If I wait on the Lord as the condition is stated in this verse, then I will see these things come to be in me. You will see these things in your life. And I like that force. Now, to expand on this force of rising up, I want to combine it with the first one. The previous example of the high and low air pressures. I want to combine the two. Just this past week, even our Pastor John was aided by high and low pressures, air pressures, to be lifted up and taken away from Atlanta to a conference in San Jose. The low pressure of air over an airplane's wings combined with the high pressure under the wings allowed an airplane weighing 175,000 pounds or 79,000 kilos to stay aloft for over 2,000 miles from Atlanta to San Francisco. And in this case, both low and high air pressures work together for a good thing. At all times of flight, the principles of low and high air pressure must be in operation to safely deliver the crew and passengers. And if at any time the combination of these pressures fail, the plane crashes. So the elements that influence our lives, those things that are the physics and forces of our living, could be things like family needs and dynamics, work, your job, natural disasters, ill health, being in the right place at the right time, or being in the wrong place at the wrong time, as we like to say. All of these things shape our orbit and have an effect on us. Your life, just cruising along, can be invaded and upended in a moment. Paul and the crew of the ship learned that. But by connecting with God, you are provided the ability to rise up out of oppression and depression, to successfully live while the pressures of various forces shape and define your perfect orbit and give your spirit proper lift, just as the air pressure lifts that massive airplane. In closing, I leave with you just one question for you to answer to yourself. In the end, with all these forces brought to you, brought for you, brought against you, brought to move you, or perhaps brought even to form your own Hurricane Dorian to devastate you. I say, after all is said and done, can you still believe that as God appoints just for you all of these pressures and forces, that He appoints them with the greatest of love? Can you still believe that? Not to harm you, but to prosper you.